This is our fifth webinar of our series, Supporting Pollinators and Beneficial Insects in Northern New Mexico, in backyards and farms. And this webinar series is a joint effort between the Xerces Society and New Mexico State University. And today's webinar is titled Integrating Pollinators and Pest Management in New Mexico Gardens and Farms. And just a couple things to note. We have a third presenter, or I guess a fourth presenter here, who is our closed captioner. So if you'd like to see captions, you can go to the bottom of your screen and click more. If you'd like to see captions, or if you don't want to see them, you can unselect to see captions. And we'll be have two speakers today, and as they're presenting and you have questions, please ask those by going to the bottom of your screen. You'll see a little Q&A option. You can enter your questions there. And please ask those early and often so we're not overloaded with questions at the end, and hopefully we can get to everyone's questions. But if not, our very last webinar of the series happening next week is an Ask Me Anything expert web panel. So we'll be answering questions that we didn't get to in previous webinars. And you can also submit questions to our email at nmsuipm@nmsu.edu. And we'll have, that email is also in the follow-up emails for registration. So please ask questions as we go through, and captions are available. So our first speaker today is Emily May, and she is a Pollinator Conservation Specialist with the Pesticide Program at the Xerces Society. She received a master's in entomology from Michigan State University and has studied habitat restoration, bee nesting habits, and the effects of pest management practices on wild bee communities. And her work with Xerces since 2015 has focused on supporting pollinators and beneficial insects through habitat creation and mitigating pesticide risk to bees and other beneficial insects. And our second speaker today is Dr. Amanda Skidmore, who is a New Mexico State University Extension IPM specialist. She is an entomologist with a background in sustainable agriculture and integrated pest and pollinator management systems. Her research has focused on improving pest management practice in specialty cropping systems, with a focus on the impacts of these management practices on natural enemies and pollinators. So with that, I think I can turn it over to Emily.
Great. Thanks so much, Caitlin. And sorry, Miranda, we had Miranda Kirsten, who's a senior program specialist for NMSU. We were hoping to have here for our introductions, but I wasn't able to figure out the technology to get her in as a panelist, so I'm sorry about that. We are recording this, and it will be available on YouTube along with the rest of the series. So this is really building on the 4 parts of our webinar series that we've already had going for the last 4 weeks. So this is the 5th in the series, almost to the end here. And today we are going to be talking about integrating pollinators and pest management in New Mexico gardens and farms. So Amanda and I have kind of split this up. I'm going to talk for the first half of the webinar today about some of the why pesticides can be a problem for pollinators and how they pose risks to pollinators and beneficials. And then Amanda's going to talk more about sort of the how-to part of how do you actually implement integrated pest management that helps reduce reliance on pesticides while also allowing you to manage pests. So those are sort of the 2 parts of today's webinar. And again, this will be available along with the rest of the series. So you can go back and watch any of these at a later date once they're up on the NMSU YouTube page. So yeah, excited to get started today. So with that, Wanted to give a thanks to New Mexico State University for hosting us, and to thank Carol Petrie Foundation, which helps support Xerces work in the Southwest. And then finally, also a big thanks to our membership. The Xerces Society is supported largely by our membership, and want to give a special thanks to everyone who makes that happen. The Xerces Society is based in Portland, Oregon, but we have staff across the country, and we're working on pollinators in agricultural settings as well as urban settings. We're also working on endangered species of invertebrates, aquatic invertebrates, among other things. We just launched a new program on fireflies just recently. So lots of things going on. Like to check us out, see our website at xerces.org. So I know a lot of you have probably been following along for this whole webinar series. So I've dialed the introduction slides down just to this one, really, since I'm pretty sure you're here if you are already aware of why pollinators are important and should be protected. The main point I wanted to just reiterate here is that pollinators are an essential part of wild ecosystems and managed ones. They're critical for food production, along for just general plant reproduction. And there are lots of different things that visit flowers, usually for the nectar that those flowers are providing them, and they end up pollinating those plants. So among all of the things that visit flowers, bees are the VIPs, the very important pollinators. And honeybees are the model animal that are used during the testing and registration process for pesticides to help evaluate how toxic those pesticides are to insects. So we're going to talk more about that later in this presentation. Many species of pollinators are declining. There's a variety of causes for that. Some of the key risk factors for pollinators are habitat loss, pesticide use, diseases in non-native species, and climate change. And we've already talked quite a bit in previous webinars in this series about habitat loss, which is really a central driver of pollinator declines across many different groups of animals. But today we're going to talk more about pesticides specifically as a threat to pollinators. And again, I'll talk about sort of why pesticides pose risk to bees and other beneficial insects. And then Amanda is going to talk about how you can use IPM to better protect pollinators and manage pests. So when I say pesticide, a lot of times pesticide is used sort of synonymously with insecticide, but pesticide is actually an umbrella term that includes, but isn't limited to, insecticides. It also includes fungicides and herbicides, rodenticides, even antimicrobials like Lysol are technically pesticides. So it's a much broader term than just insecticide. So every year in the US, more than 1 billion pounds of pesticides are applied across home gardens, parks, farms to manage unwanted weeds, insects, diseases, and other pests. The pesticides that we're most concerned about in relation to pollinators are these three. So insecticides, which are meant to kill insects, fungicides, which kill fungi, and then herbicides, which kill plants. And one reason that we're particularly concerned about pesticide use is that the whole federal process to evaluate pesticides and their risk doesn't really consider impacts to native bees and many other terrestrial insects. When we think about pesticides, we often are thinking about agricultural areas, but they're actually quite commonly used in urban areas as well. And more pesticides are actually used per acre in urban areas than in many agricultural areas. In our communities, pesticides are often used for cosmetic reasons to maintain manicured landscapes. From there, they can wash off from impervious surfaces, from grass and patios, into our waterways. And in fact, a huge percentage of rivers in urban areas, so like 90% of rivers in urban areas contain pesticides at levels that are risky to aquatic life. So there's a lot of things to be concerned about, even in urban areas. I want to talk more about what I mean when I use the word risk. So this presentation is going to have a lot of definitions, and I apologize in advance, but I hope you're ready to stick with it. Risk in this context has a really specific meaning. There are two factors in the risk of a pesticide to any organism, whether it's a human or a bee. And this is the basic sort of equation that we're using to assess risk and determine how and whether to label and register pesticides for use. So on one side of the equation is hazard or toxicity, and the other part is exposure. So if we can use a non-pesticide example, let's look at a great white shark. So a great white shark only poses a risk to people who actually go swim in shark-infested waters. So sunbathers on the beach are not likely to face a shark attack. Similarly, the sun would pose a hazard to beachgoers, but the risk would be much greater for somebody who's lying out just on the beach without an umbrella, exposed to direct sunlight, versus someone wearing a hat sitting under an umbrella. So we can make choices as people to limit our risk of shark attack or to limit our risk of sunburn, but pollinators can't change many of the behaviors that lead to them being exposed to pesticides. In order to be able to assess risk and to protect pollinators from pesticides, we have to think about the many different ways that they could be exposed. So various exposure pathways depend on the pesticide itself and how it's applied, but it could include direct contact. So like a flower is being treated with a pesticide and a bee is visiting that flower at that moment. It could include indirect contact, where maybe a field is treated and then a bee comes and visits the flowers in that field afterwards and then walks around and comes into contact with residues that have been dried on the plant. They might come into contact with contaminated nest materials. So we have leafcutter bees that are cutting little pieces of leaves out and bringing them back to their nests to line the walls and create little nest partitions. So if those plants have been treated, they're bringing back contaminated nesting materials to their homes. Similarly, they could have contaminated nest sites. So many of our bees live underground. So we need to be thinking about how they might be exposed to pesticides that get into the soil. And then finally, we have a variety of pesticides that are water soluble and systemic. And what that means is they can get taken up into plants and expressed throughout that plant in the leaves, in the tissues, and also in the pollen and the nectar. So those are things that could be brought back to developing larvae in nectar and pollen, or might just be consumed directly by an adult that's feeding on that contaminated nectar. So lots of different ways, very complex ways that bees might be exposed to different kinds of pesticides, and then other beneficial insects might also be exposed. Just to reiterate that one point about sort of exposure pathways through nesting, the vast majority of native bees, about 2/3 of native bees, and maybe even more in New Mexico, live below ground with only like really tiny holes to give any sign that they're there. And with so many bees nesting in the soil, we need to be aware of how pesticides are getting into the soil and how they might contaminate that nesting habitat. But again, exposure is only one part of the equation of risk. And the other part is the toxicity, or just how toxic is that particular pesticide to bees. So I'm going to get a little bit into the weeds in part of this presentation, but I do hope you'll stay with me. And please feel free to ask any questions you have about this now or at the end, and we'll try and get to them. So the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, is the federal agency that's in charge of registering and regulating pesticides. And the way that the EPA assesses the toxicity of pesticides to bees is based on very basic laboratory toxicity testing that looks at adult honeybees. So before a pesticide can be registered, manufacturers are required to submit a variety of different test results that have looked at the toxicity to different kinds of wildlife, so birds and mammals and fish and insects, depending on the kind of expected uses for that pesticide. The standard test animal for insects is the honeybee, and the standard test that they use to look at toxicity in honeybees is acute toxicity, acute contact toxicity. And so what that means is, in that test, a pesticide is applied at different doses to the thorax of adult honeybees, so similar to what you see in this picture. And what they're looking for is the dose that kills 50% of the tested group of adult honeybees over 2 days of observing them after they've put the pesticide on their body. That's called the lethal dose 50, or the LD50. And the smaller the dose that kills half of that test population, the more toxic the pesticide is to bees. So they use this metric, the lethal dose 50, the LG50, and they assign pesticides into 3 different toxicity groups for bees. They have highly toxic, which is pesticides that have an LD50 below 2 micrograms per bee, and then a moderately toxic, which is LD50s of 2 to 11 micrograms per bee. And then anything that's above 11 micrograms per bee is considered, quote, practically non-toxic. And I do say quote because it's kind of a misnomer. There's a lot of pesticides in the practically non-toxic category that have some toxicity to bees and other beneficials that isn't captured well by this standardized test that looks just at contact and not like what happens when it's ingested by the bee or what happens over a long period of time beyond the 2 days of observation. So EPA's toxicity classifications are really a blunt tool. Toxicity falls along a spectrum, and some pesticides are falling right on the cusp between those different groupings, and others have toxicity that just isn't well captured by this standard test. But it is the main metric that we have to work from to sort of look at bee toxicity and relative toxicity of different pesticides. So if you're interested in comparing toxicity of different pesticides based on this standard test, there is a good resource from the University of California. If you Google bee precaution pesticide ratings, this tool from UC IPM will come up. And you can search by product name, by active ingredient in the pesticide, and it will give you some information on toxicity. It also includes, it goes a little bit beyond what the EPA offers by including where available information about toxicity to bee larvae, and then other species besides honeybees. So I debated whether I should talk about this earlier in the presentation, but we'll get there now that you have an understanding of how pesticides are tested for their toxicity. But how are pesticides toxic to insects? There's lots of different ways that a chemical might affect an insect and cause harm. Insecticides are intended to kill insects. So mode of action is a term that means the specific way or the mechanism by which a pesticide causes harm. And generally, the most common modes of action for insecticides are those that are targeting the insect nervous system. So these nervous system actors are basically a lot of different ways to fry an egg. So lots of different ways to overstimulate the nervous system, leading to paralysis and death. So insecticides they might mimic a neurotransmitter, which cause signals to sort of fire continuously between cells. They might deactivate an enzyme that would typically break down those neurotransmitters. They might bind to ion channels and cell membranes that affect electrical signaling. Lots of different ways to keep that nervous system firing and leading to paralysis and death of the insects. We'll talk about a few different types of insecticides that all kind of have a similar mechanism for harm. One group I did want to point out is insect growth regulators, which is insecticides that have a mode of action that affects growth and development of insects. They're primarily toxic to developing insects that haven't reached maturity. So some of them are mimicking a hormone that causes insects to molt prematurely. And others are affecting sort of the ability to make chitin, which is the main component of the exoskeleton of insects. So when an insect molts after it's been exposed to an insect growth regulator, or it sheds its shell at some point during development, it can't properly reform that exoskeleton. So those images on the right here are showing molting abnormalities that are caused by exposure to these insect growth regulators. That's a milkweed bug on the top and a cabbage white butterfly on the bottom. The normal pupa of the butterfly is on the bottom, and then the pupa that's been exposed to an insect growth regulator is right above it. So this I bring up because it gets at how assessing risk of pesticides can be really complicated. And that standard test that we use for different pesticides is only looking at adults of one species. So you wouldn't expect an adult honeybee to be affected by an insect growth regulator, but that's still the main test that's used to assess the toxicity of that pesticide to terrestrial insects. So insect growth regulators are often classified as kind of reduced risk because they have low toxicity to adult honeybees in that standard test. But that doesn't mean they wouldn't have harm if insect larvae, including bee larvae, are exposed to them. So we have to be thinking about these things and accounting for those kinds of impacts when we're working to protect pollinators from harm. Standard testing also really only looks at one outcome, which is death, but bees that are exposed to a less than lethal dose can have other kinds of negative responses to pesticides. So sublethal effect is anything that's short of death that's observed. It could be changes in reproduction or growth and development, the ability to navigate back to the hive, the ability to forage and feed. They might affect memory and learning or immune system response. So lots of different small effects that can add up over time. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple different kinds of pesticides, but I just wanted to come back to the concept of risk really quickly before I did that. So what characteristics of pesticides make them risky? So toxicity, of course, is that first part of the equation, and then exposure the second. But part of that exposure is also how long a pesticide persists in the environment and how it moves. So how likely is it, for example, to move from a crop field where it's applied into nearby flowering habitat, or to move from a lawn treatment into the wildflowers that maybe you've planted around your yard? So beyond that, more broadly, how widespread the use of a particular pesticide is, and all of those things end up contributing to the likelihood of exposure. So how persistent it is, how far does it move, and how extensive is its use. All of these things make pesticides risky. So I wanted to talk just about a couple of different groups of insecticides that are particularly high risk based on those characteristics I just talked about. I'll go through them in kind of chronological order based on when they were released for use, but it also kind of reflects how commonly they've been used. I'm assuming a lot of you who are here have already heard about neonicotinoids and how those might be affecting pollinators, and I will get to them in just a second, but I wanted to start with organophosphates and carbamates, which are older broad spectrum insecticides that themselves are risky too. So sometimes I think our focus on neonics causes us to forget about some of these other major insecticide classes that also raise concern for bees. So organophosphates and carbamates are insecticides that target the insect nervous system. And one of the issues that these pesticides have is that this mode of action is actually not limited to insects. So they bind to and inhibit an enzyme that breaks down a neurotransmitter and keeps electrical signals firing between cells. But that neurotransmitter is also found in humans. So these organophosphates and carbamates can have more human toxicity than some of the insecticides that target insect-specific neurotransmitters, if that makes sense. So one of the OPs, organophosphates, that you may have heard of is chlorpyrifos. This is an estimated use map of chlorpyrifos in 2016. And there's not much of use of it in New Mexico. It's more of an agricultural product that's used extensively in California, and clearly also in the upper Midwest and Great Plains. But it has a variety of human impacts, and some of those uses that it has had have been phased out because of that, but it still is extensively used. Some of the other common organophosphates you may have heard of include malathion, phosmet, and diazinon. Carbamates have a similar mode of action, and carbaryl, or 7, you might have heard of 7, That's one that's actually, we see a lot of concern with that in certain fruit crops, particularly apples, where carbaryl is actually used for chemical thinning right when flowers have just dropped off. So there might still be some bees in the orchard. They use it to sort of thin out apple clusters so that you get bigger fruits. But it's a very toxic pesticide to bees, so using it while bees are still in the orchard isn't a great idea in terms of risk. And so when we think about risk, we definitely shouldn't get complacent about pyrethroids, which is another group of insecticides. Pyrethroids are the synthetic relatives of pyrethrins, which are organic pesticides derived from the chrysanthemum flower. But before you fall for the marketing that pyrethroids are somehow equivalent to the naturally derived and pretty unstable, short-lived pyrethrins, pyrethroids are engineered to be more stable and in some cases considerably more persistent. So the two things aren't actually equivalent. So pyrethroids are broad-spectrum insecticides that affect, again, the insect nervous system. They bind to sodium channels that lead to those cells continuing to fire. They're extremely common in both ag and urban settings and are used on more than 50 million acres of cropland, often as cleanup sprays right before harvest. Bifenthrin is the most common pyrethroid. It's used on over 14 million acres nationally. This is the use map for that, just one of the many pyrethroids. It's quite common on row crops and is highly toxic to bees on contact. Pyrethroids are also used in mosquito management. So permethrin is a pyrethroid that's used on around 9 to 10 million acres annually as a mosquito adulticide. So about a third of all adulticide acreage is permethrin, which is a pyrethroid that's used. So a lot of pyrethroids end in thrin. So when you see the active ingredient, it's things like bifenthrin, zeta-cypermethrin, lambda-cyhalothrin. Those are all pyrethroids. Okay, so this is the last group I'll talk about. These are kind of some of the big three classes that we often are talking about in terms of toxicity to bees and other beneficials. So neonicotinoid insecticides are widely used in agricultural and urban settings. These were released in the mid-90s as an alternative to the OPs and carbamates because they're more insect specific. So these have lower human impacts than some of the earlier pesticides. They bind to a neurotransmitter site that's common in insect nervous systems, but not in vertebrates. So this kind of relative toxicity is an important thing to keep in mind as we think about replacing neonics. So what are the alternatives and how might those alternatives impact farm workers and other pesticide applicators? We need to make sure we're thinking about those kinds of outcomes as we craft policy. So why have neonics gotten so much coverage? It's because they have this particular combination of characteristics that make them particularly risky. So they're highly toxic to bees, and they're also systemic. So from the exposure side of things, they're moving into pollen and nectar in a way that bees might be able to bring back to their developing larvae or consume themselves. And they also move very easily into aquatic systems because they're water soluble. They're highly persistent, so sometimes remaining at harmful levels in woody plants and soil for months to years after they were applied. And even untreated plants that were planted in areas that had a neonic application can take up and express neonics in pollen and nectar in those areas. So this figure on the right just shows you how ubiquitous those became over time. This is neonic use in different crops, starting from when they were introduced in the mid-90s through, I think, 2012. So neonic seed treatments were used on close to 100% of corn acreage by 2011. So lots of potential risk, just even based on widespread use. So that's why we talk a lot about neonics, but they are not the only source of risk in terms of pesticides. And they're also not even the only systemic insecticides. There's actually a lot of different insecticides that have systemic activity and could find their way into nectar and pollen or honeydew that are produced by insects that are feeding on plant tissues that are contaminated. So I won't get into a full list here, but please do reach out if you have questions about any of this. We're also at Xerces working on a publication spelling out some of the risks of all the other things that are systemic. So we're thinking about what other highly mobile chemicals are out there that pose risks besides neonics. So one last thing I wanted to mention here about insecticides is that just because it's organic doesn't mean it's non-toxic or that it doesn't present risk to pollinators. So I often hear things like, oh, well, it's just neem oil. Well, neem oil and its active component, which is azadirachtin, are they're insect growth regulators, so they can have impacts on developing larvae. So it's organic, but it does have potential impacts on insect larvae. And those are things to keep in mind as you think about potentially using that in your garden. Another one that's common in organic gardening and farming is BT, which is a soil bacterium that produces these crystalline proteins that poke holes in insect stomachs. So different strains of BT are specific to certain groups of insects. And the most common one that's used is a strain that targets Lepidoptera, or butterflies and moths. So in your standard toxicity testing, you'll see it's practically non-toxic to bees because it's specific to butterflies and moths. But is it safe for other beneficial insects? Not if you're concerned about butterflies. So that to say, it doesn't mean that organic pest management is at all on par with conventional pest management. Many organic pesticides, with the exception of some of the heavy metal fungicides like sulfur and copper, are less stable than their synthetic cousins. So they break down more quickly when they're exposed to air and water and light. So an example of that would be pyrethrins. They're quite unstable in UV light, so they break down pretty quickly, whereas the synthetic pyrethroids are quite persistent. So they're not equivalent, but I just wanted to mention that, it doesn't mean that it's risk-free. We have this guidance that I just published last year on organic pesticides. So if you want to go in and look at some of the relative risks and some of the potential concerns of different organic pesticides, I would recommend going in and digging into that guide. So that was insecticides. And while insecticides pose the most obvious risks to pollinators, other types of pesticides also present some risks. So to talk a little bit about fungicides, current fungicide use patterns, fungicides are used for plant diseases of various kinds. They're leading to widespread exposures of different bees and beneficial insects to fungicides across ag and urban landscapes. We talked about systemic insecticides. A lot of fungicides are also systemic and can be taken up into nectar and pollen. And in some surveys of bees collected and beehive materials collected in agricultural landscapes, fungicides are actually the most abundant pesticide found in honeybee hives. Part of the concern that we have about fungicides, they almost always come out as pretty low toxicity in adult toxicity testing, but they can interact synergistically with certain insecticides that in a way that increases the toxicity of those insecticides to bees. And then more recent research on fungicide is showing significant risks beyond just the synergistic effects. So they can affect bees' immune systems and gut microbiome in a way that makes it difficult for them to fight off disease and makes them more susceptible to infection with gut pathogens. A recent study found that fungicides were the strongest predictor of the prevalence of a particular gut pathogen in 4 declining bumblebee species, and also was the most significant predictor of range contractions, or the contraction of those ranges for those bumblebee species. So the fact that we're seeing harm to bees from fungicides that are listed as practically non-toxic, it demonstrates that there's a lot of complexity here, and it's really challenging to understand risk, and that it's not just what you find on the product label. So this is partly why we're promoting longer term solutions to reduce the need for and use of pesticides. So the final thing I'll mention here on impacts is on herbicides. So one contributor to the bigger bucket of habitat loss or reduced habitat quality is herbicides, which are used to kill weedy plants or prevent plant germination. So there are a handful of herbicides that have some toxicity directly to pollinators. So paraquat would be an example of an herbicide that has some toxicity. And we're just beginning to understand some of the sublethal impacts. So again, we're seeing certain herbicides may change gut microbiome composition of honeybees, might change feeding behavior or navigation behavior. But in general, we think the largest impact is probably indirect in the impacts on habitat and the removal of nectar sources and host plants. When it comes to addressing pesticides, we're looking for solutions at all scales. There's lots of changes that can start right at home in our yards and gardens and farms. For those of us who don't have yards and gardens or aren't using pesticides to begin with, we can start to cast a wider net, thinking about how you might advocate for change in towns and cities or at the state level. We do have a Xerces model policy that we've helped pass in dozens of local communities that helps outline the steps to building more habitat and reducing the risk of pesticides to pollinators. At the federal level, we have less power to implement change, but when changes are made at that level, they can have pretty sweeping impacts. Our federal efforts just generally include reaching out to USDA and EPA and other agencies to ensure that they're fully responding to the risk of pesticides, in particular for native bees and other pollinators. So protecting pollinators from pesticides isn't just about making sure the product you buy doesn't have a warning sign about bees. So an important first step is not considering pesticide products to be the first line of defense if you have an unwanted plant or insect in your yard. So especially in yards and gardens, we'd like to see greater elimination of pesticide use in response to cosmetic concerns, aesthetic concerns rather than the health of a plant or the loss of a crop. So a lot of times those types of cosmetic issues might be avoided in the first place by planting the right plant in the right place and by providing habitat for beneficial insects that keeps pests at manageable levels. So where cosmetic issues do arise, so I'm up here in Connecticut actually, and I have New England aster in my front yard that has chrysanthemum lace bugs that turn all the lower leaves brown. But it's really just an aesthetic issue. It's not at all about the health of the plant. It just kind of looks a little bit ugly. So my aster foliage doesn't look perfect, but lace bugs aren't going to kill those hardy plants, and they're providing a food source for other things in my garden. And the aster flowers themselves are still beautiful. So a set of principles that can help farmers, gardeners, city park staff, and other land managers think through pest management decisions from a prevention first perspective is integrated pest management, or IPM, which is a term that will probably be quite familiar to some of you. Maybe it's the first time some of you have heard of it, but either way, IPM is a framework that provides some more of the how in how we can approach managing pests while protecting pollinators. And Amanda is going to talk through more of the how of IPM in the second half today. But essentially, the main core of IPM is about monitoring and doing some research to identify and know exactly what pests and diseases you're dealing with so that you can make informed choices about what strategies you can use to prevent those pests and diseases from reaching the point of an outbreak or a real infection that causes real damage. So it's a system based on monitoring and scouting, using preventive practices to break pest and disease cycles, and then only applying a pesticide if and when preventive strategies have been exhausted and your monitoring tells you that a pest has reached damaging levels. So that's the basic framework. And the principles of that framework are something that could be implemented in a lot of different kinds of environments and a lot of different scales. So from your backyard to city parks and municipal properties, schools, greenhouses, natural areas. We're working with a lot of growers and backyard gardeners and city park staff to implement these kinds of prevention first practices, to think about non-chemical ways to address core pest issues. So if you're interested, I'll show you resources at the end here, but we just did put out a new fact sheet on smarter pest management for cities and college campuses using IPM principles, which is available on our website. Just a few more slides here. In a well-executed IPM framework, a farmer or a city parks manager or a gardener would only apply pesticides as a last resort when preventive measures are inadequate or not feasible and pest is at a level that has reached damaging levels. So it's unrealistic we're gonna eliminate all pesticide use in agriculture and even in some urban settings. So the other part of this is thinking about how we can actually mitigate risk where pesticides are used. So we are thinking about mitigation strategies that reduce both toxicity and exposure for pollinators when pesticides are used. So that risk equation is going to help you think through how you can mitigate risk. Avoiding use of highly toxic pesticides and high-risk use scenarios, so like pesticide mixtures that might increase toxicity when they're applied together, so an insecticide and a fungicide that are mixed together, and when they hit a bee, those interact in the bee to be more toxic. Many of those kinds of high-risk scenarios are addressed in another of our fact sheets on protecting habitat from pesticide contamination. So that's toxicity, reducing toxicity of pesticides used. And then to reduce exposure, treating only the area needed, so spot spraying an individual plant or section of a field, or other ways to limit field treatments. And then finally, not allowing pesticides to drift onto flowering habitat and certainly not applying them to flowering habitat. One of the things that we're often dealing with at Xerces is figuring out how to make sure we are creating habitat that's protected from pesticide contamination. So our guidance on protecting habitat includes some recommendations for spatial buffers around pollinator habitat based on the kind of application equipment, with a larger buffer for more highly mobile insecticides. But those numbers really aren't hard and fast, and they're certainly not cautious enough for some scenarios. Spatial buffers are also difficult when the only space available is right next to an area that's being treated with pesticides. So a crop field or a golf course or a town park, you can't always change what your neighbor is doing, even if you might have something to say about it. Where that physical distance isn't possible, you could plant vegetative barriers that consist of non-flowering, non-attractive woody plants that capture some of that pesticide drift. So if you're interested in digging in for more detail on lots of the things I've touched on today, we have a lot of resources available at our website, xerces.org, which range from publications like on the left here that are diving into the impacts of different kinds of pesticides. We have a guide on organic pesticides, on fungicides, on neonics, and then fact sheets that are more sort of focused on those how-to recommendations. How do you protect pollinators at home? How do you protect them on cities and college campuses? How do you protect habitat? And if you go on our website and you've looked through our publications and you feel like there's still a subject that needs more attention or that you can't find info about, please do let me or other people at Xerces know. We're often writing these guides in response to questions and concerns that come into us from farmers and gardeners and others. So I'll just end on this slide. I know my part of the presentation is really like the doom and gloom part, but I wanted to end with a quick, thought meditation on our team's philosophy of change at the Xerces Pesticide Program. So our vision is really a future where all landscapes, towns and cities, farms and natural areas can enjoy thriving and diverse, abundant invertebrate populations. This kind of vision takes solutions at all scales, which includes both voluntary changes on the part of gardeners and farmers, as well as regulatory solutions that can lead to some broader changes. And we've talked about both of those solutions a little bit today. This work is guided by science, but also by the precautionary principle, which is taking preventive action in the face of uncertainty and shifting the burden of proof to the proponents of an activity. So in this case, pesticide manufacturers, and exploring a wide range of alternatives to possibly harmful actions. I have learned over the years pesticides can be a really challenging area to work in. There's lots of strong feelings on all sides. What we're trying to do is to meet people where they are and encourage them to move out of their comfort zone to achieve conservation goals. Implementing alternative non-chemical strategies for managing pests can feel like a big risk. It's a big ask, a big step outside of a comfort zone when crop yields are at risk, for example. But the long-term payoff can be greater ecological health, greater farm worker protection. But we are going to keep asking. And most of our work is through outreach like this webinar and building solid relationships with people, working together to find solutions that work. I will hope you take that all to heart as you work in your own communities to conserve pollinators. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Amanda to talk more about integrated pest management and implementing the how-to that you might have come for in terms of resources for managing pests while protecting pollinators.
Great, thank you, Emily. That was a great introduction to some of the stuff that we're going to be talking today. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over to my screen. So hopefully we can see the presentation now. Do we look good, Emily?
Looks good.
Awesome. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about pollinators and integrated pest management. So, once we get the pointer working, let's start by defining what integrated pest management is. So integrated pest management stands for an effective and environmentally sensitive approach to management, which is going to combine different techniques to manage pests, and most of these are going to be common sense practices that we use already in our gardens. So IPM is not a principle that can or should be strictly and equally applied to every situation. And that is to say, we have a lot of different people from a lot of different areas of New Mexico and some states surrounding us that are joining us today. And one of the things to think about is that not everyone has the same climate or the same resources available to them. And the idea of implementing IPM in your system is to take these techniques that we learn about and to implement them in a way that makes sense to you. And one way that we can kind of try to encapsulate this or envision this is by looking at this model, which may be a little bit overwhelming, but we'll try to break it down to help make sense. So IPM is a system of ideas to help us better control our pests in the environment. So if you look at this graphic and you have the big circle around the outside, this circle is representing sustainability. So we're looking for pest management options that are economically viable for us, that are environmentally safe, and that are acceptable to use in our area. And then we need to think about the different components or the different people that are involved in implementing an IPM system, whether or not it's for a backyard garden or for a small farm. You're still going to have somebody who's working in the field, that's our producer. You're going to have somebody consuming the end product, and then you're going to have somebody who is going to be selling things in that system. So we want to try to keep that sustainable as well. If we break the things in the bubble down a little bit more, we can talk about the idea of communication. So IPM involves a lot of knowing what's going on within your community, pest management wise, staying up to date with new techniques, being involved in what's happening in your community. There's ideas of planning and organizing. So making sure that you take action to look ahead. If you're going to plant a particular plant, think about what pests might want to attack that plant a couple months down the road as it's growing. Also, think about gathering information and monitoring things that are happening in your garden. We have the whole spectrum of pest management, where there's all sorts of different techniques that we're going to get into here in just a minute, but we're going to have these different techniques and approaches to managing pests in a holistic way. And then there's the idea of knowledge and resources. So this is learning about the different pests and different plants that are in your environment, the good ones and the bad ones, learning about the pollinators and the natural enemies, thinking about control options, and learning about tools and technology. So if you're new to learning about IPM, it can be a little bit overwhelming to look at it first. But one of the great things that NMSU has is that we have the cooperative extension services. So each county and has a extension service. And if you look at the resources on our website, you can find county or tribal agents that are specific to your area, and they're going to have a lot of excellent resources and knowledges about the things that are involved in your own community. So our encouragement is always to reach out to your county agent first and ask them your questions, because they're going to have much more specific knowledge about your certain area of New Mexico. So we also are going to talk about how pollinators play into IPM. So we know that there's a lot of pollinators. We've been talking about this for several weeks now, but there's a lot of different insects and some mammals like bat, and we have our birds too that are going to be helping to pollinate different plants in our environment. So the concept of adding another P into integrated pest management, so IPPM, or Integrated Pest and Pollinator Management, has become really important. And the idea is that the way that we're managing pests, we're also going to be thinking about these holistic ideas for pollinators as well. So for an example, in a lot of our different agriculture settings, we have pollinators interacting with us every day. So whether or not it's beehives in an apple orchard, and if you're managing a pest in apples, you have to remember that the beehives are there and are going to be exposed to those management practices. Or if you have a smaller garden that has different things in it, you might have some specialist pollinators like squash bees that are going to just pollinate your squash, or you might have things like bumblebees that are going to be interested in pollinating your strawberries or your tomatoes or other things that are in your garden. So knowing what pollinators you have and incorporating them into your management practices is important. So we've talked about this before, but New Mexico has over 1,000 species of native bees. Some of them are generalists and some of them are specialists. Some of them are going to be ground nesting and some of them are going to be stem nesting. And in New Mexico, we also have a lot of honeybees. And these are also called managed pollinators because they are managed by us. The colonies are set up and we're responsible for their management and upkeep. So we have both groups of bees in New Mexico that we need to think about when we think about management practices in our gardens. So if we look at just a general bee life stage, we're going to have a mother bee lay its egg. The larva is going to develop. It's going to pupate. We're going to have an adult stage, and then that adult's going to lay eggs again. So we have to think about these different life stages of the bee and different times of year that these bees might be in these life stages when we think about pest management. So we have some bees that are soil nesting. So some of them dig out burrows in the ground and they place their eggs in those burrows and they develop over a season. Some of them are cavity nesting, so they're going to be looking for small cavities where they can make their nests. Some will use old stems of perennial plants. Some of them will use logs or twigs that they find. Some of them will, even if you've got cracks in your house or a garage or a shed, they will sometimes use that as a resource as well. But we have to remember that pest management poses a lot of threat to bees, and so how can we think about that? So not only does pest management have a threat, we also have other things happening in the environment, from climate change to pathogens that might be being spread between different bee species, different management practices for agriculture, the idea that a lot of our land is being fragmented, so natural habitats are being fragmented into smaller areas as we expand either with agriculture or urbanization. So bees can be exposed to insecticides in several different ways. And I think this graphic's great, and it takes a while to process. So if you want to come back and watch and look at it later, that's cool too. But They can be exposed through wind, they can be exposed through the food that they're eating, they can be exposed through contaminated water or contaminated soil. So bees are coming into contact with these chemicals that we use all the time. So when we think about building an IPM plan and implementing things, I like to think about it kind of in this triangle example where we need to have a strong foundation and then we work our way up to more aggressive management practices. So we're going to start with practices like prevention and trying to prevent pests from entering our environment. And then we're going to use things like cultural and physical controls, as well as biological controls. And kind of at the very top shelf, or if you think about that old dieting chart from the 90s, the old food pyramid chart where we had sugars and fats at the top, that's where we're going to place our chemical use. We really want to use it as a last resort for pest management, but chemicals are considered a part of an IPM plan. So we need to talk about those as well. So when we think about prevention, there's a couple different steps that we can think about. So plan ahead, know what you're planning to plant in your landscape, be it vegetables or flowers or on your farm, and select different cultivars that might have better resistance or tolerance in your area. Think about the space that you're going to be managing. Try to keep it clean. Try to clean out old plant materials, remove weeds that can harbor pests. If you see diseased or sick plants, remove those from the environment because a lot of times our pests can help vector those diseases between plants. Also, try to reduce your plant stress by watering and fertilizing and keeping your plants as healthy as possible. Try to plant plants that are appropriate for your environment, so not every plant is suitable for the climate that you may want to plant it in. So learn about the plants that you're looking to grow. We can use some cultural controls. So these are practices that we will manage in our garden. So these are things that we can do that don't necessarily cost us any time or any additional equipment or things like that. So we can think about sanitation. A lot of times cleaning out old plant material before the winter comes is important because a lot of our pests will overwinter in that old plant material. So either burning it or throwing it away and removing it from your property is important. When we think about different management in regards to pollinators, there's several cultural controls that can help with our pollinators. So when we're thinking about pest management, we can go out and we can scout for pests, but we can also scout and see what pollinators may or may not be in the environment. We also want to try to keep our plants healthy. This means that there's going to be less pest pressure because they're going to be more resistant to pests. And healthy plants, especially if you're planting floral resources for our pollinators, they're going to be more nutrient rich for those pollinators. You can also think about things like plant selection. Some plants are going to be more resistant to pests. Some of the flowers that we plant might be more beneficial to pollinators. Also think about the idea of using cover crops. Cover crops are a great way to put nutrients back into your soil, but some of our cover crops like clovers or cowpeas or there's lists of cover crops that we can use in our gardens or on our farms that have flowers that will help to feed our pollinators as well. We also have the idea of mechanical controls for pest management. So this is the idea of using barriers like row covers or mesh netting to prevent pests from accessing our plants. We have the ability, if we're at a small scale, to go through and hand remove pests. We can prune out infested materials. We can use traps and lures. So some of these that are specifically good for pollinators or things that we should think about for pollinators include the use of barriers. So barriers are a great idea for any of your plants that do not need specific pollination. So some of your lettuces or things that aren't going to have a flower and produce a fruit or a vegetable for you. So row covers can be left on, and we don't have to worry about for how long. We just have to monitor temperature and make sure that the plants aren't stressed underneath. But if you have a fruit or a vegetable that needs pollination, like the squash in the picture here, then you need to be able to remove those row covers when you start to see flowers so that the bees have access to them. So row covers can be a really good thing that prevents pests, but when we start thinking about our pollinators, we need to know what species of plant need to have pollination and at what time so that we can remove those row covers so the pollinators have access to them. Things like rinsing off plants, this is a super safe thing for pollinators because they're going to fly away from any water that you might be spraying, but this can also trap a lot of our pests and wash them off of our plants depending on what they are. And then the idea of traps and lures, a lot of traps and lures are specific to specific pests, so they are going to not attract as many of our pollinators as some of these other methods. So you might see, if you use a sticky trap, you might see a few pollinators accidentally get stuck to it, but it's going to be way less than if we used a different type of treatment. At a small scale, lures can be successful and sticky traps can be successful. If we're talking about larger acreage, these are a great monitoring tool. So these can help us know when pests come into the area and when it's an appropriate time to treat for pests. We also have biological controls, and I think probably the most familiar one to us is the idea of a ladybug eating an aphid. So I know we talked a lot about natural enemies further back, and I know Miranda shared a lot of great information on that. So if you missed that talk, we'll make sure that you can get access to it. But we really want to encourage natural enemies in our gardens, and practices that protect pollinators also protect natural enemies. So the idea of providing conservation practices such as habitat and resources through floral provisioning and flower banks is a great way to increase natural enemies in an environment. We also want to remember that different natural enemies fill different roles depending on their life stage. So some natural enemies are pollinators, like this adult syrphid fly. It's a pollinator of many different garden plants, but its larva is a predator. So they can be beneficial in different ways, and they have evolved to have different niches that they fill at different life stages. So we really want to try to encourage those natural enemies to be in our environment. Another idea for biological control is to add pollinator refuge areas and overwintering habitat. So we know that a lot of bees will nest in stems and twigs. So we want to try to leave those standing in our gardens, or to cut them down and leave them in a sheltered place so that the bees will have the ability to emerge as adults in the following spring. Also, we want to plant a diversity of floral resources. So some flowers only are blooming in the spring, some only bloom in the summer, some bloom year round, some bloom in the late fall. So making sure that you have a good diversity of resources in your yard is really important. So when we start to think about chemical control, one of the things that we need to think about is thresholds and when it's appropriate to treat. So there's two different scales for this. If you're a home gardener, you have the ability to choose the threshold for pest tolerance. You might be more tolerant of pests than someone who is a producer that is looking at the economics of their production system and knows that they need to make a certain dollar amount, and so that it might be more appropriate to treat for pests sooner. So to break this model down, we have this idea of an action threshold. So this is the time to treat. So for a lot of our producers, if you reach out to your county extension, they're going to be able to help you know for your area when you're going to hit that economic threshold and what pests are important. But then we also have, for like home gardeners, your action threshold, again, might be different than that. So one of the questions that came up last year that is an interesting thought for this is I had someone come and ask me about bean production, and they said they were having a huge spider mite problem on their beans. And as we talked about it, I asked her, okay, what stage are your beans in? How many beans have you harvested? And she's like, oh, I've got cans and cans of beans. My plants are, pretty much close to the end of the season. These mites are just getting out of control. And so with talking with her, we decided that probably for her, the best management practice, instead of spraying a miticide or trying to control the mites, would be that she had already received all the benefit from those plants that she wanted. And so going ahead and removing those plants from the environment was the pest control option she chose. So one of the things about IPM is that we can talk about these different pest management practices and how they'll work for your own situation. So I want to buzz through these slides really fast to show you some different damage that we might see. So for insect damaging signs that we're trying to identify in our garden, because identification is really important, we need to think about things like chewing, mining damage. We might see wood boring damage on some of our trees or shrubs. We might see piercing, sucking damage, gall formation. When we're looking at weeds, which are also pests in our landscape, we might see different types of girdling, we might see roots, or we might actually see the physical weeds competing with our plants. For diseases, we're going to see a lot of different signs of diseases, and that can be everything from our fruit rotting, it can be viruses, blight, cankers, or we could have other plant damage. So things like water stress or herbicide damage or an animal that's coming and chewing part of our plant off. So we can even have compounding problems on top of that. So we might have weeds that become an insect habitat for our pests. Some of those weeds harbor plant diseases, so the insect pests that are using them as a habitat, when they move to our specific crop, they might be bringing that disease to our plant. And weeds can also overcrowd the plants that we're trying to grow. Insects, they're going to be vectors of those plant pathogens, and then plant pathogens can become secondary issues once the plant that we're growing, its immune system becomes weak and things can be attracted to it after that. So I know we went through all of those really quick, but this is one of the reasons it's important to know your pests. So we've showed lots of different insects and different pollinators throughout this series, but here are two things that you might commonly find in your garden. They're both yellow, they're both very small, they're only about 1/4 of an inch, so you're probably going to need a magnifying glass or a hand lens to be able to see them clearly. But one is a beneficial and one is a pest. So on the left-hand side, we have the leaf miner that's going to be doing different damage, and there's different species that'll cause different damage to different types of plants. But then we have the syrphid fly, which is a pollinator, and it's a predator of some of our pests. So this can be super overwhelming, but one of the great resources that NMSU has when you run into a pest problem and you're not sure how to handle it is that you can submit samples to our plant diagnostic clinic, and you're able to do that through your local county extension agent, and we have lots of information about how to properly submit samples. And then those will be sent to campus where we're able to help identify specific pest problems for you and be able to give you recommendations. So this is an excellent resource. If you just even Google plant diagnostic clinic, you'll be able to find lots of great information about the NMSU plant diagnostic clinic. When we start to talk about chemicals, which Emily has covered a lot of already, we want to try to choose less toxic pesticides. So we need to know what chemicals are less toxic to our pollinators, which is going to include reading the label and understanding how that chemical works in the environment. So try to use products that are going to minimize effects on our natural enemies and our pollinators. Use practices that are going to try to reduce pollinator exposure. So if you are going to use an insecticide, maybe spray in the evening. A lot of our pollinators are more active in the early morning or into the mid-afternoon, but towards the evening they're usually retire for the night. Always scout before you spray anything to make sure that you don't have active pollinators. Try to avoid spraying when it's windy because we don't want to see any of that insecticide drift. And if you notice that a particular plant is in bloom, try to avoid spraying while there are active blooms on the plant. So timing is a really important thing with insecticides, and you can look at different stages of your crop to determine whether or not it's an appropriate time to spray an insecticide. When you're using a pesticide, we want to think about the fact that insecticides are often more toxic than a fungicide or a herbicide, but fungicides and herbicides can have compounding effects that can make our pollinators sick or more vulnerable to insecticides. Always read the label and check the area that you're going to spray. Look for things on the label such as pollinator protection statements. Check for the presence of blooming plants before you spray anything. Also, if you're having someone come into your property to make some type of a chemical treatment, make sure that you check for all the pollinators before you call them and have them come in, just so that you don't end up with a situation where both the spraying and the pollinators are in the same location at the same time. So there's going to be some things that are outside of your control, and these are things that we can start having a conversation about how to change. So your surrounding landscape, you can't control what happens over the fence beyond your yard, but you can share information with your neighbors in your community about how to protect pollinators. You can also create your yard as kind of an island or a habitat for pollinators. So pollinators can have large foraging ranges depending on what species they are. They can travel several miles to collect food, or they may travel just a few meters to collect food. But our yards, as we begin to take some of these practices, can really help to provide resources and an island for those pollinators. And hopefully, as more and more people adopt these practices, these islands will start to connect and provide habitat for our pollinators. We also can't really control climate, but we can be aware that climate is changing and that we need to provide extra protection for our pollinators. So when we think about implementing integrated pest and pollinator management, we need to remember that pollinators forage across the landscape, so we need to take a landscape approach to managing them. When we think about our pests, try to consider all of the suitable management practices that we could use to control those pests before reaching for that insecticide. Use practices that we've talked about to discourage pests in your environment, and be careful to diagnose the pest problem that you're having to make sure that it's the pest that you think you have is actually the pest that is there and isn't something else that might be happening in the environment that is impacting your plant. Also, determine the need for treatment through scouting and monitoring. If you're not out looking to see what pests might be there, you're not familiar with how your environment changes. So this is just an opportunity for us to go out and observe what's happening in our own landscapes or green spaces or farms. When we use pesticides, we need to try to think about some of these protection ideas. So only use a pesticide when needed. Try to use the lowest appropriate label rate and at the appropriate time. So some folks think that if you cut the amount of insecticide you're using, that you are benefiting the environment because you're not putting as much insecticide into the environment. But what actually is happening is that by reducing and not using the appropriate amount, we are creating resistance in our pest populations, so that in the end, more insecticides will have to be used and there's a greater chance of exposure for other things. So if you do use an insecticide, use the appropriate amount and prevent drift and consider your timing. Also, for your own personal protection, always make sure that you read the labels and follow the label rules exactly. So pesticides are managed through legal resources, and when you buy a pesticide or you use a pesticide, the label is the law. So you have to follow the rules that are listed on that insecticide. Also think about when we want to provide pollinators resources, what resources are available to them. We can provide pollinator habitats like Emily talked about. Also, two of the important things is the idea of providing resources at the beginning and end of the season. So at the end of the season, towards the fall, which is where we're coming up to, our pollinators are going to be finishing provisioning those nests for their offspring. So it's going to give them the opportunity to boost the resources for their offspring for next spring. And then, next spring, we need to think about when those bees start to emerge and they're hungry and they're looking for food resources, what types of plants might be blooming and that we could plant that would be resources for our pollinators. So at NMSU, for our IPM resources, my lab operates a website that has lots of great information. We also have several social media pages that you can find us on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, and follow us, and we put out updates all the time about things that are happening in New Mexico, things that are happening around the world that involve pest management and IPM. And you can always send us questions to the NMSU IPM email address. If you go onto our website, we do have several different guides that are available for downloading. So we have a backyard beneficial insects in New Mexico guide. We have integrated pest management for common insect pests of trees. And we also have native bees of New Mexico and our pocket guide to beneficial insects. And all of these are going to be great resources when you're trying to think about specific things to New Mexico and where you would like to start integrating best management practices and IPM. So we have several current projects that are happening, so stay tuned as the rest of the year continues. We're going to be having some more webinar series, and we're going to be sharing some more information from our different resources. So once COVID lifts, I hope folks will connect with us. We have a wonderful learning garden. So for our different field days, we'll be able to welcome folks to view some of the different practices in person, and we do teaching and education there. We have different workshops that will pop up throughout the year. We're going to be working on some IPM for honeybees coming up, and all sorts of different programs. So we'd love to have you guys stay involved and to learn more about us. So again, you can do that through contacting us or through connecting with us on our Twitter and Facebook pages. And that's all I have for today. And I guess we can switch over to some questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Amanda.
Yeah, thank you both. That's a lot of really great information, and we have lots and lots of questions. We'll try to get to as many of them as we can in our short amount of time, but we will be able to address these in the next webinar, the expert panel. So I'll jump right into questions. We have a few about BT. Emily, I think you know your stuff about BT, but there's some questions about does it hurt pollinators and beneficials? And then a question about a BT donut in a rain barrel, and if to control mosquitoes, and if water from that rain barrel is safe to use for watering your plants.
So I can start, and Amanda, feel free to jump in at any point to follow up. So on the question about the BT dunk, I said, I think during my presentation, that the most common BT is meant to kill caterpillars. And that's true for vegetable crop applications, but there are many other strains of BT that are specific to other insects. So BT dunks for mosquitoes, that's a strain that's specific to mosquitoes and gnats. So using that water on plants wouldn't harm caterpillars. That said, those products are not labeled for use on edible plants. So I wouldn't use that water on your garden if that's where you're using it. Amanda, is that what you were going to say?
Okay, yeah, I would agree. When as soon as the dunk or the pellets hit the water, they're going to start breaking down. But again, they're not labeled for use for vegetables, or fruits. So I wouldn't recommend using them on a garden afterwards. To water flowers, sure, but not necessarily anything you eat.
Yeah, totally.
All right. And can you talk more about, is it spinosad? Spinosad?
Yeah, I could talk more about that.
Yeah, and is it toxic to bees and pollinators or beneficial?
Yeah, unfortunately, spinosad is an example of one of those organic insecticides that's highly toxic on contact to bees and other beneficial insects. It's one of the more toxic. So spinosad and pyrethrins are kind of the top in terms of toxicity of organic insecticides to pollinators directly. That said, dried residues of spinosad are much less toxic. So this would be an example. I saw there was another question about spraying when bees are not active and how does that work because they're eventually contacting the residues. So this is an example where if you apply in the evening or at night and the residues dry overnight, those dried residues are much harder for bees to sort of actually bring back with them anywhere. And they would be much less toxic at that point. So that's an example of where that strategy would be more protective of day active pollinators. I did one other thing to say about that is so spraying when bees aren't active is about sort of what we talk about all the time with pesticides, which is the dose makes the poison. So a dose that a bee might be exposed to from a direct spray during the day when they're flying is much higher than what they're going to encounter from residues or that from things that have started to already break down in sunlight. So that's why you'll see that advice. That said, it doesn't work when you're talking about systemic insecticides. So part of the concern about systemics is that they're expressed in pollen and nectar. Insects might be continuously exposed to low doses of those chemicals. So moving an application to nighttime doesn't actually take away the sort of main way that a pollinator might be exposed to the pesticides over time.
Yeah, and some of the things to add on to that is that some of the crops that we grow, think about things like apples that bloom early in the season and then don't bloom the remainder of the year. So those are things that your pollinators early in the season are going to be very attracted to. So waiting to use a management practice until after those flowers are gone might be a smarter way to reduce the insecticide exposure. So think about which crops you have and which insecticides might be appropriate for that crop and the timing.
Thanks. All right. How safe is it to consume honey given all the different sides in the landscape?
So about honey almost always has detectable levels of pesticides. But one of, again, the key points in toxicology is the dose makes the poison. So those levels of residues that you can find through like very detailed lab testing might be relevant for insect toxicity, but they're generally well below levels that would be any concern for dietary exposure in humans. So yeah, you don't have to, honey is safe to eat. But yeah, sometimes hive materials have levels of pesticides that could be toxic to the insects living in those hives.
Okay, could you talk more about inert ingredients, and do you have thoughts on the precautionary principle? I know you mentioned it a little bit, Emily, in the end of your talk.
Yeah,
and
this is a much bigger.
Is involved in those efforts.
This is a much bigger question. So yeah. Inert ingredients, I don't think I even defined active ingredient in the course of my presentation. Active ingredient is the one in a pesticide formulation that is supposedly the real mechanism for any action that pesticide is taking. An inert ingredient is a chemical in a formulation that's not the active ingredient, and that theoretically, even in the name, is inert. It's not doing anything. But there's a fair amount of research that is now beginning to emerge that inert ingredients, so things that are added to that formulation to improve performance or just the way that it mixes, Things like organosilicones are inert ingredients that can be highly toxic to bees. They might act in other ways, like increasing susceptibility to viruses. So those are unfortunately not listed on pesticide labels. So in terms of the precautionary principle, I guess it comes back to sort of our general advocacy for better and more comprehensive risk assessments before anything gets registered for use. In the United States, we would like to see the risk assessment process take more of a precautionary approach before a pesticide gets labeled for use. That the burden of proof falls onto the manufacturers to say, no, these aren't causing harm, and we can demonstrate that in our testing. But currently, the risk assessment framework leaves a lot out. There's a lot to be desired, including inert ingredients and adjuvants, which are chemicals that are added to a spray mix to improve performance. So lots of things that we would like to see addressed in regulatory frameworks.
And I think one of the things too about reducing or to be thinking about when we think about inert ingredients is that even in our food products like ketchup or hair or shampoo products, we also have a lot of those inert ingredients that we encounter. So it's not just being used in insecticides, but we find those in other things. So it's not necessarily bad, but it's good to know what they are and whether or not they're having an impact.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, someone has some container plants that were probably treated with neonicotinoids. Will they be able to use seeds from this year, or will those seeds also be contaminated, and can they use the soil from those containers?
So treated plants are a little bit tricky. I will say you can plant the seeds of treated plants next year and they should be fine. Those residues are going to be so minuscule. Whether the same soil from the containers should be used again sort of depends on whether that's the soil that you received from the nursery that treated the plants. I wouldn't use the soil again if it was from the nursery because it might have been a soil application of neonics. But if you transplanted the plant into fresh soil, it would be fine to plant in that again. I mean, I don't know if you have other thoughts on that.
No, pretty much the same thoughts. Although we recognize that neonic is going to be breaking down in the environment. So the more that it's exposed to the environment, say if it was incorporated into another plot or moved around, then it's probably going to be breaking down pretty quick. So it wouldn't be as high of a concern, but if you're seeing negative impacts, then probably trying to take that soil out is a good recommendation.
And, did you have one you wanted to address on there?
I'm just looking through here. I know we're not going to get to all of these.
Yeah.
We only have like a minute left. Amanda, did you see any that you wanted to address as you look through here?
There are a couple questions about garden sanitation and where is that balance between how do I keep pest habitat from forming versus how do I keep habitat for pollinators and beneficials? Where's that balance?
Right. So if this is kind of the rule that I think about. If you look at the plants that are in your garden or in your landscape, the ones that are annuals, those are ones that aren't not going to come back on their own next year. So it's pretty safe to go ahead and remove that material, especially because that's where a lot of your pests are going to overwinter. Whereas a lot of our perennials, they will start to die back. And then especially some of the flowers that have some of the stalks that the bees like to nest in, it's pretty safe to leave those until the following spring. So we really want to just take the material that we know is going to cause a problem and remove it. So if you're into composting, just making sure that if you have like an entire squash plant, you don't just throw the whole squash plant into the compost pile, but you chop it up and combine it in really well so that you don't have these pockets where pests can hide. Is that pretty much?
Yeah, that sounds right. I was thinking about this recently. I got a question about how to manage apple scab in apples, and one of the best cultural managements for that is you want to take the leaves out. But we're also always talking about leaving the leaves for beneficial insects. So there is a trade-off there where if you have a disease issue, you have a pest issue, and that the only way to break that cycle is to take those materials out of your yard. that's what I would do. And there will be other places in the landscape that beneficial insects might be nesting. But if you know that you have you've created the perfect, spore inoculum in your apple leaves that are underneath your apple tree, just take them out. So.
All right, that's all we have time for today. Thank you guys so much. There's lots of comments in the Q&A of thanking you guys for your great presentation. And also just a reminder that New Mexico State University Extension and the Ag College has lots of great resources. You can always contact Xerces employees. And Linda Walsh in the Q&A mentioned that the Master Gardener's Hotline is also a really good resource for asking these kinds of questions. And what we didn't get to in the Q&A today, we'll try and address next week in our hour-long expert Ask Me Anything panel. So thanks everyone for tuning in, and thank you, Dr. Skidmore and Emily. Appreciate you. And we'll see you next week.
Great.
Great. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.